It's just, oh, okay. Yeah, so I hope everybody's okay with us recording this tonight. Thomas will be putting it on the York Politics Society YouTube account for you all, if anybody wants to watch it back, if it's really good. Or if not, no, it will be, I'm sure. No pressure, guys. Yeah, so we're really lucky to be joined by some fantastic speakers tonight. We're joined by Dr. Jonathan Dean from Leeds University, Dr. David Duriesmith from Sheffield, our own Dr. Alasia Nuti will be speaking, and Dr. Pinar Dokumaci, a York postdoc. Let me think what else I've got to say. Sorry. We'll start with Pinar, who will outline a recent hashtag that's trending in Turkey. It's called #ChallengeAccepted and how that relates to Me Too. Jonathan will then follow on with a history of Me Too within the framework of the last 20 to 30 years and the changing landscape of feminist thought in relationship to this and problems with allyship. Don't mind my dad joining. Good timing, seeing as I've been on the call for 45 minutes. Where was I? And then David will be telling us more about masculinity transformation programs and the politics of engaging men in gender equality. And finally, Alasia will be explaining to us the complexity of sexual abuse and Me Too and how we can make sense of sexual abuse claims. If anyone's got any questions, you can feel free to type them into the chat throughout the discussion. And if you want me, I'll message privately if you want me to read them out for you at the end, or you can message me privately and then I can read them out for you if you like. So yeah, I can't think of anything else. Thank you for Thomas and Gemma and PolSoc who've organised this for us tonight. Yeah, our speakers will speak for roughly 10 minutes, if that's how long you want to speak for. Yeah, I think we should just get started now. I'm sure Thomas will add something if I've missed anything off. He's not one to keep quiet. But yeah, if Pinar, if you want to start us off.
Hello, everyone. After a brief moment of technical difficulties, I'm very happy to be able to hear you all, and I'm also very happy to be here today. And first and foremost, of course, I would like to start by thanking Thomas and Gemma and everyone who organized this event. This October indeed marks 3 years after the exposures of Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too hashtag going viral. And so it is about time to look back and reflect what has been achieved, what has been left out, what remains to be done. And in times of reminiscence, we often rewind the story to the very beginning. We go back to the origin. As a viral hashtag, Me Too goes back to that one tweet by Alyssa Milano in which she called out for the survivors of sexual abuse to also speak up as she did and say Me Too, so that the magnitude of the problem becomes visible. So Me Too was about visibility, awareness and consciousness raising, about sexual abuse. The hashtag and the campaign, as we know, was neither original nor novel. Similar campaigns were launched in other countries years before, and the hashtag itself paid a tribute to the Brooklyn-based grassroots initiative that was operating for more than a decade at the time when Weinstein was first exposed. So the aim of so it's important to remember the original aim of this grassroots movement, Me Too, which was about forming a community of support and encourage empathy between survivors of sexual abuse and help them heal from shame and trauma. And to quote the movement's website, it aimed at assisting a growing spectrum of survivors, young people, queer, trans, disabled Black women and girls, and all communities of color. So Me Too was more than the merchandise. Me Too was more than celebrities in Black. Me Too was more than that famous and epic Oprah Winfrey Golden Globe speech. And Me Too was always a part, and a very small part actually, of the Black women's struggles in the US. So what happened to the Me Too movement 3 years ago was that it went global within hours, and all of a sudden, more Weinsteins have been named, more controversies have been exposed, more courageous women chose to speak up. And they spoke up knowing that their Weinsteins would probably not end up in jail. So there are many, many different issues to discuss regarding the effects of Me Too 3 years later. But since I study the women's movement in Turkey, I would like to talk about the Turkish context in my remaining minutes. Rather than going to the origins this time, I fast forward to current day and talk about a relatively new hashtag that became viral and went global about a month ago. Challenge accepted. Perhaps you remember those black and white photos of celebrities with some sort of a message written underneath it in your social media feeds. So regarding challenge accepted, first of all, there were mixed reactions internationally. Some criticized women sharing pouting selfies as a shameless self-promotion, hypocritically in the name of showing support to a campaign about women supporting women. Some criticized the campaign's choice of language, which presented women supporting women as a challenge to be accepted. But to many people, how this campaign came into being and managed to go viral was uncertain. So I personally saw the first black and white images of, well, basically everyone, like every Turkish woman that I've ever met around 21st of July. It was the day after they found the body of Pinar Gültekin in Turkey, in Western Turkey. She was a university student and she was reported missing for about 5 days before that. And her pictures from her social media accounts were everywhere for like during all those 5 days as the police was searching for her. In the pictures, she looked very happy, young, very beautiful, full of joy and full of potential. And finally, like 5 days later, the primary suspect, Cemal Metin Avcı, the man whom she was trying to break up with, they were only dating very recently, and she wanted to break up with her because she found out that she was married with kids. And this man, Cemal Metin Avcı, confessed and that he killed her in the spur of the moment by a mistake, and then gave a very, very detailed account of how he beat her to death, then strangled her, then set her dead body on gasoline, and then covered it all up by concrete. All in the spur of the moment, of course. And what happened the next day was all of the news outlets in Turkey printed and shared the same pictures of Pinar that they printed and shared 5 days ago, but this time in black and white. So Pinar's picture is looking very, happy, pretty, having fun, possibly pouting, and wearing a mini skirt. One of them was with a bikini top. And make no mistake, this is very common. This is how the mainstream government-controlled Turkish media handles femicides normally. And the numbers of femicides in Turkey are like skyrocketing like crazy. Like to give an example, after Pinar's death, which was like end of July, and after the challenge accepted hashtag became viral or global and attracted celebrity support, and after nationwide protests to follow all that, 68 women were killed during August 2020 alone by a male family member or by their partners. So that makes like at least 2 people in Turkey, like 2 women in Turkey, die every single day because of femicide. And to report these femicides, the news outlets almost always mute the color of the photos of these women, the photos that they share on social media, living happy, colorful lives. And make no mistake, the choice of these pictures is not like, it's not innocent at all. It gives the message that if you dress in a certain way, wear makeup, or God forbid, flirt with men and then dare to break up with them, then you might get killed within the spur of the moment. So when Turkish women were posting their pouting selfies in black and white and accept the challenge, that was resistance. The challenge was about not getting killed and having lipstick on at the same time. They stood by and supported the life choices of these women in those pictures and blamed the murderers. And it seems such a basic thing, but it was a radical act. It was also to say that this could happen to every one of them because 2 women get killed every day. I should also note that Challenge Accepted coincided with a time in which women throughout Turkey were protesting actively and during an environment of the pandemic because of a possible withdrawal of Turkey from the Istanbul Convention, the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. And yes, it is named Istanbul Convention, ironically. With less institutional mechanisms to seek justice. Women in Turkey know pretty well that femicides are bound to increase even more, and abusers and murderers will continue to walk free. So when global celebrities iterated the Challenge Accepted campaign and posted their pouting pictures or like very kind of seductive poses in black and white, perhaps for them it was just a photo in which they look great. But for women in Turkey, there was a sense of being seen for a fleeting moment. But this would not have happened without Me Too. And although it doesn't, it might be a very small difference, a fresh breath is also very important during struggles like this when the environment is very repressive. Meanwhile, in the international media, the origins of the Challenge Accepted hashtag was reported to be uncertain, aside from, and I quote, alleged theories that the current trend began in Turkey to raise awareness about femicide or the killing of women based on their gender, which is an ongoing issue in the country, as if it is not happening elsewhere. So therefore, the story behind Challenge Accepted remains hidden, mostly hidden, because when it is a country like Turkey and not the US, the experiences of women are deemed too specific for the context, perhaps. And this is even after what has happened in Me Too. This is even after what has happened after Black Lives Matter. People feel a need to generalize. They want to make it more accessible to the Western audience. and make it, and that means making it a little bit less uncomfortable, a little bit more hopeful. So the trade-off for going viral in the case of Turkey was the story itself got largely discarded. And after all, like people, like the woman who initiated this knew this would happen because the stories that they were telling was too complex to tell in a single tweet. So the real challenge, I think, is, and it should be accepted, is of course pretty Spivakian, you know, it's like it says for women, not just to speak for, but also listen and really listen to those complex stories of other women. And the real challenge is also, and it also has to be accepted, is about ensuring independent justice systems and international and local institutional structures of rights and freedoms that work for everyone, regardless of sex, gender, race, ethnicity, or color. So I don't know how many minutes I've left, but this is all I'm about to say for today. Thank you all for bearing with me.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you. Jonathan, I think we've got you next.
Okay. Okay. Well, firstly, just to say, you know, thanks so much to Rhiannon, Thomas, and Gemma for organising this. I'm genuinely really excited to be here, and yeah, I hope that what I say will be of some use and some interest. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not really going to talk very much about Me Too directly. What I want to do instead is, at least initially, talk a little bit about the history of feminism over the past sort of, well, in my lifetime really, so, you know, sort of 20, 30, 40 years, and say a little bit about how Me Too kind of fits within that, and then I'll end with some other reflections as well, but I'll come to that in a minute. So look, here's the thing. I mean, like, what I'm going to say may be obvious, and my apologies if it comes across as such. But I'm often struck when I hear about or read discussions about Me Too in particular and feminism in general, that I fear that we sometimes risk losing sight of just how kind of unusual or strange the current historical moment or conjuncture, if you're being kind of slightly technical, is in terms of the status of the current gender regime, and how that relates to broader narratives about and perceptions of feminism. Now, let me just briefly explain the context of this, right? So I, like many people, first became interested in gender and feminist politics when I was an undergraduate student. That was in the early 2000s, which maybe to some people watching this may seem like ages ago, but to me, frankly, feels quite recent. The changes, certainly in sort of Anglophone contexts, in the kind of status and perceptions of feminism in that time have been really quite dramatic. And Me Too, I think, is a symptom of that. So when I first became interested in gender and feminism as an undergraduate student, sort of circa 2003, there were a set of narratives and assumptions about feminism, which a number of feminist scholars at the time were trying to make sense of. And the academic field that I think was most fruitful in terms of making sense of this was the field which we might call feminist cultural studies, right? Now, to be perfectly honest, I'm a political scientist, and to be quite frank with you, I don't think political science as a discipline has done a spectacularly good job of making sense of changes to gender relations in Anglophone contexts over the past 20 years. I think cultural studies as a discipline has fared much better. Anyway, that's kind of another story. But what I do want to stress is that within feminist cultural studies, there was this a common argument or narrative which argued that the gender regime at that time, so sort of circa 20 years ago, was one that was described as post-feminist. And this argument is given its most sustained articulation in this very interesting book here called The Aftermath of Feminism by the feminist cultural theorist Angela McRobbie. It was published in 2009, but draws on work that she did over the sort of 10 years leading up to that. And basically the argument goes something like this, that in a post-feminist gender regime, certain kind of quasi-feminist ideals were taken into account or even affirmed and supported across a wide variety of political and cultural spheres. So these would include things like positive affirmation of women's economic independence, participation in the labour market, and to some extent at least a kind of affirmation of women's sexual autonomy as well. And these are kind of sort of quasi-feminist ideals, but they were supported rather ambivalently, because these existed alongside what McRobbie calls a kind of forceful repudiation or denunciation of feminism as an identity or as a kind of set of political commitments, right? And what this meant, that feminism as an identity was sort of, well, it was at best uncool, and at worst, like vehemently attacked and disavowed. I realize it is still vehemently attacked and disavowed now, but I mean, I guess I'm talking primarily in kind of like sort of relatively sort of left liberal kind of, you know, among communities of sort of social science students, right? So like, I remember when I was a university student, like the people who were feminists, right, were kind of seen as a bit odd, right? It was seen as kind of an exception to be a feminist. Whereas now I sort of feel that it's kind of, among my students anyway, students that I teach, it's almost more unusual to be a feminist. Sorry, more unusual to not be a feminist than it is to be a feminist. And I think that reflects the fact that from, I mean, I don't know when exactly, but I think the economic crash of 2008 was perhaps kind of pivotal. From then onwards, I think you started to see a real kind of sea change in the visibility and status of feminist discourses and feminist ideals within mainstream politics, within mainstream media, and within kind of mainstream popular culture in, again, primarily in Anglophone contexts. And so from about sort of 2008 to 2010 onwards, you had quite a sudden kind of resurgence of a whole wide variety of forms of feminism, right? Of various forms of grassroots feminist activism. And that then permeated into kind of more mainstream culture. So you now have a situation now where you have lots of quite mainstream pop stars, people like Beyonce, Taylor Swift, Ariana Grande, Dua Lipa, are all quite enthusiastic in their embrace of a kind of feminist identity. And this, I think, reflects quite a significant change in the dominant gender regime in which we live, one in which feminism has shifted from being something that was previously a rather niche kind of marginal concern to one which now has a much greater status and visibility across kind of mainstream, well, across a whole wide variety of different spheres. And if you will indulge me for a moment, one kind of, for me anyway, one particularly resonant example of this is the fact that in my spare time, like when I'm not doing academic stuff, I like birds. I like bird watching. I like to go out into the countryside with a pair of binoculars and try and find birds, right? And I've done that for all my adult life and some of my not adult life as well. And basically for most of the time, I've tended to think of these two worlds as separate, right? I go bird watching for fun at the weekend, and then I study my gender and politics stuff or whatever professionally. And for the most part, these were separate, but recently they've kind of converged in slightly weird ways. So we're now in a situation where among kind of birdwatching communities, there are now quite intense discussions about gender relations among birdwatchers and how to make birdwatching more inclusive in relation, particularly to gender, but also in relation to race and class. And I think that is testament, right, to the permeation of feminist discourses into a whole variety of spheres in which they were not previously present. And there's one elaboration of this phenomenon which I particularly like, which is this. Sorry, it looks like I know it looks like I'm sort of being a bookseller, but it's just useful to hold up books. Which is this excellent book here, again by a feminist cultural studies person, Sarah Bannett-Weiser, a book called Empowered: Popular Feminism and Popular Misogyny, which I think is a really good documenting of this kind of shift from post-feminism to what Bannett-Weiser calls popular feminism. Now, so look, and of course, suffice to say, Me Too, as a movement, as a phenomenon, is both a cause of this renewed visibility of feminism, but I think it's also a symptom of it as well. I don't think Me Too would have taken on the resonance that it had we not been living in a moment where kind of there was this renewed engagement with feminism across a wide variety of spheres in the kind of years leading up to the taking off of Me Too 3 years ago. So like overall, I guess what you could say is that I'm pushing what might sound like a sort of optimistic narrative. You could say that I'm trying to push back against a kind of pessimistic view that sort of emphasizes feminism's marginalization. And that's true to a certain extent. But I want to end by kind of qualifying that, right? Which is to say, although I think we shouldn't lose sight of the gains that feminism has made in terms of the wider cultural and political traction that it currently enjoys, there's a lot about the current status and character of contemporary discourses about feminism that actually make me quite pessimistic. And I just want to, there are lots of these. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I just want to mention two things in particular, okay? And the first is the fact that, well, again, this may be obvious, so my apologies if this is obvious to people listening to this, but feminism is not intrinsically or always inevitably tied to an emancipatory or progressive politics. And one thing that I have found particularly depressing in Britain over the past sort of few years, I think it is a specifically British phenomenon, is the ways in which a lot of the dominant narratives about feminism have tried to kind of attach it to a politics that is often, in my view at least, pretty reactionary. And the most obvious manifestation of this, I suppose, is the phenomenon of linking feminism to a politics which is hostile to trans rights, okay? But that's not the only manifestation of it. I mean, I think it's also an attempt to kind of, try and kind of extricate feminism away from a kind of more progressive politics, more generally in relation not only to gender identity, but also in relation to race and class, sexuality, and so on. And again, so I've got one more book I want to show you, but this book here by Alison Phipps called Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism articulates some of these problems quite well. To be clear, I don't agree with every single thing Alison Phipps says, but I think it's a good indication of some of these problems. And then the final a kind of worry or sort of reason that I feel pessimistic is, and again, you perhaps you might be more something you might expect me to say as a kind of cis white dude who's banging on about this kind of stuff. It's about the question of allyship, essentially. I mean, I'm not sure I even like the term allyship, but we'll use it for now. I think one of the real failures of the Me Too era actually is that I think, and again, others may disagree, but I think we've really failed in our collective political imagination to cultivate positive models, I guess, of allyship and what it means to stand in solidarity with marginalized groups that you yourself are not a member of, right? And I think there are three ways, there are three kind of tendencies within current models of allyship that make me depressed or pessimistic. And it seems to me that allyship in the era of Me Too tends to manifest itself in three problematic ways. One is a kind of model of allyship as self-beratement, right? This idea that you kind of like say, oh, I'm terrible, I'm complicit with everything, I'm a really bad person. And that I don't think gets us anywhere, because I think, ironically, self-beratement is also a form of self-aggrandizement. So I think it just recenters the very problem that you are ostensibly trying to move beyond. The second problem is, in the era of Me Too, I fear that we tend to work often with quite binary divisions between good men and bad men, right? So if Weinstein is like the archetypal bad man, then male allies like me can like come along and say, oh yeah, well, we're not like him, we're not like those bad guys over there. And I think that often reproduces very binary models of good versus bad. And I think that what we lose sight of then is a model of allyship that is sensitive to varying degrees of complicity, right? Whereby nobody is purely innocent, right? We're in some respects, we're all kind of both, what's the word? We're both victims and oppressors, albeit to different degrees and in different contexts. Or the final kind of way in which problematic allyship manifests is in disavowing one's privilege or one's kind of power by making often quite what I think are often frankly quite spurious claims to marginality, by trying to kind of disavow your own privilege by making visible your own membership of marginalized identities or categories, which which may evince varying degrees of spuriousness. And obviously there's one particularly vivid recent example of this, right, where there's this academic in America called Jessica Krug, who had been claiming that she was black and had made a living as an anti-racist scholar, but then it turned out that she was a white woman from the Kansas suburbs. And people reacted to this as if this was a very unusual development. But I have to confess, I wasn't remotely surprised it happened, because I think it is a symptom of this broader tendency whereby instead of acknowledging and confronting privilege and trying to think that through, we try and actually make, in this case, totally spurious claims to membership of marginalized groups. So I do worry about our collective inability to cultivate more productive models of allyship and solidarity in the era of Me Too, and that is all. I will leave it at that.
Thank you. That was really good. Thank you. Just before David speaks, if anybody has any questions, you can type them into the chat or you can privately message me. I know I've just had a few new people just in case they were wondering how to go about that. But yeah, David, whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks again to everyone who's organised this. It's great to have a chance to come and talk to you about some of these issues that I've been thinking about. What I'm going to be talking about today is following really directly on from what Jonathan's introduced around allyship, and it's around the role of men, or how do we think about the relationship between men and Me Too, broadly speaking, but I'm going to be talking in a more general sense about preventing men's gender-based violence. So there are a few different categories we might think about the role in relation to Me Too. First are as members of the movement who are articulating their own experiences of sexual and gender-based violence. For example, Terry Crews' discussion about his experience of sexual harassment from a producer at a Hollywood party. The second category is one that for some of us is all too visible, that is of men as a group who are often involved in resistance or backlash politics through men's rights movements, trolling, just your standard internet poor behavior. But finally, what I'm talking about more specifically today is what might we think about in terms of men, masculinity, and change. I come into this as someone who researches masculinities and shifts away from violence, for the most part within post-conflict societies or conflict-affected communities, but also within military institutions and other armed groups. And one of the constant struggles that's been developed in this space is we tend to know quite clearly that men, broadly speaking, although not universally, have problems with patriarchal behaviour, whether this is conscious and actively pursued or unintentional and benevolent. Forms of masculinity that idealise men's dominance, assertiveness in public, entitlement, all coalesce around men engaging in behaviour that either facilitates, supports, belittles, or directly engages in violence. And how do we think about what we might change in relation to this? So the first thing I want to emphasise before I get into the nitty-gritty about what programs might look like that shift men's behaviour and the problems with that, I want to talk really quickly about what are masculinities in the first place. Very often when we talk about men and masculinity, particularly after Me Too and in the Me Too space, there's a tendency for us to discuss it as if there is hypermasculinity or toxic masculinity on one end and femininity or effeminacy on the other. That masculinity is a kind of linear scale that one can go from butch to not. Now, research on masculinity would tend to resist this idea. What we would tend to suggest is that there are multiple contested ideas of what it means to be a man within any given social context, and that these arrangements of masculinity are privileged and rewarded in different ways, policed in different ways depending on the context. In a society like Britain, for example, the form of masculinity that might be idealised for a politician to engage in might be very different to masculinities that are idealised within the armed forces or within the trades. But they are all at the same time venerated or reinforced models of masculinity that are socially acceptable within those given spaces, despite the differences. This leads to a problem in a lot of the public discourse around Me Too, because of a kind of common sense understanding of who the perpetrator is. Again, something that Jonathan brought up, which is really important. We have this sort of figuration in our mind of the unattractive, predatory senior male figure within a powerful industry who predates on younger, attractive women within his sphere and uses his position of power in an exploitative way. Now, this is, of course, a true, relevant, and important story, but that is not the only pattern or way in which exploitation and abuse occurs. And it has a particular class and racial dimension that we can either imagine the lecherous boss in comparison to more commonplace narratives that we've had around strangers in dark alleys, which have their own racial and class dimensions. More broadly, though, if you look at the research on masculinity, norms, and gender-based violence, what we tend to find is that men in general, along with women, will often have a broad set of values and ideals which facilitate and make violence possible. Whether this are ideas about what behaviour is expected around dating or sex, about assertiveness being attractive, desirable, or preferable for a man, and around certain forms of communication and speech as demonstrations of masculinity. What we find is that it's not just exceptional forms of masculinity that are the problem. It is everyday models of masculinity that need to change. But then, what should we do to engage in changing this? If masculinities are varied, but also have commonalities, that there's complex relationships between them, that they might have mutually opposed or varied ideas about what makes them masculine, how do we engage in shifting these ideas? Well, a lot of the work that I've been doing is particularly around programming. And this is one of the ways that I would see Me Too suffering from some of the risks that earlier movements have, which is to become corporatized, individualized, and policy-based, rather than a broader political movement predicated on men's involvement in pro-feminist politics and fundamental transformations of gender. A lot of the work that's been done in the masculinity space has happened in a few core areas. First is in schools with respectful relationship training, direct work with young men at a time when they're seen to be able to shift their behaviour. The second is with perpetrators, directly running programming with those who have already been convicted for perpetration of gender-based violence or as a result of a warning being issued, or work with groups of men to shift their attitudes once they're already on board with feminist politics in men's small group programming. Now, for the first two sets, there's a challenge here in relation to how we think about change. And when we often imagine who are the perpetrators, for the category of the Harvey Weinsteins, they're constructed as these exceptional monsters who no one could understand. How could anyone do this? For the other category of the sort of stranger in the street, it tends to entail a distinctly classed and raced imagination of often a black or brown perpetrator on the street who has deficiencies in masculinity, whose masculinity is toxic, not as a critique of gender relations under patriarchy more broadly, but singling out their particular performances of masculinity as problematic or non-normative. This often comes along with broader class and race anxieties about the way that certain groups of men behave and the targeting of them for interventions that ask them to shift behaviours in order to reshape patriarchy. This has been challenged by criminologist Michael Salter, who argues that when it comes to gender-based violence programming with men, we very often end up preoccupying ourselves with asking men who often have the least power under patriarchy to change it fundamentally. Programs that get run are usually run with young men, with stigmatized men, with men who don't have substantive power, and then they're told to shift their own behavior. In comparison, an area that I've seen a lot in my own work internationally, men are asked to become male advocates, champions of change, or visibly present themselves as allies. In comparison to the younger, more marginalized men, these groups tend to be Hollywood celebrities, political leaders, business leaders, men who are already rewarded and privileged on the basis of their performance of masculinity in society, and are then contrasted to the few bad apples. This leads to a unfortunately comfortable understanding of what Me Too politics is about, rooting out the few of them that are bad, finding the idealized forms of masculinity that the rest of us can emulate, and working on ways that can coercively work to enforce those forms of gender performance on those who just don't know how to do it properly. This, of course, is entirely insufficient from a broader or more radical feminist perspective, which would argue that Me Too is not the result of a couple of men just going too far in their masculinity, but that masculinity in mainstream acceptable forms contains messages about violence, domination, men's possession of women, and the eroticization of control that makes these things seem like they are logical, inevitable, and unchangeable. And that these ideas are not just present within those who we might visibly read as hypermasculine. For example, this may be not your experience, but one thing that I've observed is that the performance of dominance within university settings does not often happen from a guy walking in, tearing his shirt off to ripped muscles, exposing his gun, and using physical power to overpower everyone in the room. However, what I have seen in quite a few seminars in the last 9 or so years I've been teaching at university is you will have a young, educated guy who will try to dominate conversation by talking over people, using rhetoric and debating techniques to undermine other people's perspectives and silence them. This is also a performance of dominance in masculinity. This is a model of masculinity which doesn't demand the physical strength that I see, for example, when I work with former foreign fighters, but it is a form of masculinity that associates manhood with a capacity to exert control over a group. This is a value which is linked directly to forms of sexual harassment, male domination and abuse, and the cultures which are present in sites not only like Hollywood, but across our society more broadly. So where do we go in terms of engaging with this? There are a couple of problems I would like to outline and very few solutions because it's 10 minutes and that's more fun. In terms of the first problem, we tend to have this very common sense understanding of what bad masculinities are, of what problematic masculinities are, but there's been much less meaningful discussion about what positive masculinity looks like beyond slapping an ally sticker on a few public men who are willing to adopt the position of the good guy in the room. The second problem that we have in relation to this is, if we advocate that men become pro-feminist allies, as Stephen Burrell and Michael Flood have highlighted in a recent piece, allies to which form of feminism? Feminist politics differs substantially on a range of issues. One brand of pro-feminist men's politics, for example, has worked heavily on challenging men's attachment to and use of sex work and prostitution. Another angle of feminist work would say that that whole approach is regressive, undermines women's agency. The Me Too movement demands that men change, but we haven't always had the conversations about changing into what? What might that look like? Beyond that, by focusing on the most egregious forms of predatory and violent behaviour, there haven't always been the full conversations about how men's everyday engagement with sexuality, attraction, courting relationships reproduce oppressive and harmful ideas about what it means to be a man and how men should relate to women. We might have very clear ideas that you should not engage in explicit rape or sexual violence, but a broader critique of heterosexuality and men's attachment to it, I think we've still got a very long way to go in relation to that. Next is the structural one. This has a risk when it comes to men becoming too individualized. Some men are pathological and they need to change. This narrative doesn't give us much attachment about how is it that men come to value these behaviors. What are the institutions? For example, the centering of aggressive cis-normative heterosexuality within schools or within popular culture, within ideals about men and women's interactions. This lack of a structural account can lead to the neoliberalization of work, and masculinity transformation as a political movement gets stripped out in exchange for a few light-hearted programmings in school that get soon discarded and moved on to the next issue. So where I'll just end up here is to say, I think that there's a really important role of addressing men and masculinity in relation to the legacy of Me Too. For the most part, unfortunately, men are the problem. That doesn't mean that we have very clear ideas about what it would mean for men to be the solution or what that outcome is going to look like in terms of the steps to get there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I've made a lot of interesting notes there. Alasia, if you'd like to round up the speaking now.
Yeah, I feel lots of responsibility now.
I know.
Right? It's amazing works, right? I just want to thank everyone. So first of all, the organizers for this amazing and very timely event. Also my co-speakers for really fascinating talks and all participants. So I'm going to share few slides. So while I'm trying to do it, I just also want to warn that because I'm gonna talk about two stories of sexual abuse, I will also give some details, not too many, right? But we know that one detail may be enough to trigger really bad memories and make someone feel uncomfortable. So I just wanna say that. Right, so as my co-speaker already said, I also think that the Me Too movement, did some really good things. Although, as Jonathan pointed out, it was not, the cause of this more widespread talking about sexual violence. It certainly contributed to this shift. And now, more stories about sexual violence are in the mainstream. And I think that the Me Too movement is in part to be credited for the increase in students who are not self-declared feminists, but are taking modules in gender and politics, or at least that's been my experience in the last few years. But I think that it's not only important to talk about sexual abuse, it's also important to reflect about how we talk about it, and specifically what can be said and understood as sexual abuse, and what are the discursive frames of our culture. So as I said, I'm gonna talk about two actually intertwined and interesting cases, but I'm not interested in whether these cases are true or false. I don't think that it's my job or it's my place to assess, right, the truthfulness or falsity of these charges of sexual abuse. But I want to try to understand how we make sense of these stories as claims of sexual abuse, and whether really the discursive frames through which we really make sense of sex, of victims and survivors allow us to make sense of these claims as claims of sexual abuse. So if the Me Too movement urges us to believe, as we should, maybe all survivors, what are really the preconditions to even make sense of someone as a survivor of sexual abuse and someone's story as one of sexual abuse. So now in trying to focus the attention on this sort of discursive frames of sexual abuse, I'm not alone, right? I'm in a sense in good company. So Linda Alcoff, in a recent book on rape and resistance, a book that I strongly recommend everyone, calls for what she calls a new epistemology of rape, meaning a new understanding of the ways in which our collective knowledge of the problem has been formed and might be improved. And what I wanted to suggest, and this is also in line with what Alcoff argues, is that in order, right, to, in a sense, have a different epistemology of rape, we need really to embrace the complexity of the categories of victim and survivor, the complexity of sexual abuse, and in a sense embrace the ambivalence of sexual abuse stories. So what do I mean by that? So let me go through two cases. Some of you may know Asia Argento. So Asia Argento is quite a celebrity in Italy, an important actress, and was one of the first high-profile actresses who publicly accused Harvey Weinstein of sexual assault. So she recalled Weinstein forcing himself on her and performing oral sex despite her request to stop when she was only 22. And has actually many survivors of sexual assault do. Argento declared that she blamed herself for what happened for many years. Now, the relationship between Argento and Weinstein didn't end there. So Argento argued that she engaged in an on and off sexual relationship with Weinstein. And again, you know, anyone who has worked with survivors of sexual violence knows that this is not actually an unknown phenomenon among survivors of sexual abuse. It's actually a way to try to normalize an event, right? Sexual abuse incident. So since Argento accused Weinstein publicly, she became the target of a pretty bad smear campaign in the Italian press, which really questioned her credibility as a survivor of sexual abuse. So some opinion writers claim that, unfortunately, I'm quoting, you know, so it's sort of literal translation, but Argento first gave it away, then whined and faked regret. Others suggested that Argento used sex to further her career, calling what happened between her and Weinstein prostitution, not rape. And again, I'm quoting literally. So how is possible, some asked, that she kept having a personal and professional relationship with a man she alleged that abused her? And these comments actually were made by self-identified male opinion writers, but also by self-identified women, right? So what people seem to suggest is that she didn't make sense as a survivor of sexual abuse. Her story didn't make sense as a story of sexual abuse. Now, on August 19, 2018, the New York Times published allegations that Argento sexually assaulted actor Jimmy Bennett. Argento had first met Bennett when he played in the role of her son in 2004 in the movie The Art is Deceitful About All Things. And Bennett was 7 years old at the time. So the alleged assault occurred in 2013 when Bennett had just turned 17 in California, where the age of sexual consent is 18. Argento was 37 at the time. Bennett claims that in their encounter, Argento gave him alcohol, performed oral sex on him, and had sexual intercourse with him. Argento had arranged a $380,000 non-disclosure settlement with Bennett in the month following a revelation regarding Weinstein. And Bennett claims that after Argento became one of the leaders, right, so one of the public faces of Me Too, he decided to speak out about his experience of sexual violation, which he claims had a long-term effect on his mental and physical health. Now, what I'm interested in is, again, not whether these claims are true or false, not my job to assess them, but the reactions towards these stories. So what were the reactions, right, about Jimmy Bennett's allegations? So on the one hand, like some took that opportunity, right, to challenge once again Argento's story, right? So like from, and that seems quite unsurprising, Weinstein lawyer who argued that, Argento was just an hypocrite and that, should have challenged the legitimacy, right, or the credibility of her own story of sexual abuse. But even like, other people with not, apparently big interest in discredited Argento, like Enrico Mentana, who is very prominent and well-respected Italian journalist, argue that Argento should have never come forward with her charges against Weinstein. So in different ways, both these attacks implied that Argento's alleged perpetration of sexual abuse renders her own story of victimization void. But interestingly, and in the sense, this is something that I'm more interested in, many people, and sometimes the same people, also challenged Bennett's story of abuse. Many people said in the press that as a 17-year-old male teen, Bennett couldn't have been a victim of sexual abuse perpetrated by a woman. On the contrary, many affirm that, again, because he was a 70-year-old man, Bennett could only be perfectly aware of what was happening and given his consent to it. After all, some further ask which male, of 17 years old will not desire to have a sexual encounter with an older, more experienced, attractive woman. And you can imagine all the very bad jokes about it that were published in the press. Now, I'm interested in these stories, not only because they are intertwined, but I'm interested in these stories because they have lots of common. In both cases, there's a sense in which these stories don't make sense to many, right? Not to everyone, to many, as stories about sexual abuse. And this is because of the discourse prevailing in our society about sexual abuse, which shapes the understanding of many of the phenomenon and the affected parties. So again, I'm not interested in whether Argento or Bennett's account are true or not, but how it's very difficult for some people to make sense of them through the frames in our culture set out who can be victimized, who can be accused, which are plausible narratives about sexual abuse and in what context sexual abuse may be spoken about. Now, both Argento and Bennett do not follow the frames of the perfect victim or the victim at all. Argento had a sexual relationship with her perpetrator, and she allegedly sexually abused someone else while denouncing the abuse she experienced, while Bennett is a young man who is accusing an attractive older woman of sexual abuse. In both cases, patriarchy undermines the intelligibility of their claims. Again, not saying whether the claims are true or false, but whether they can make sense as claims of sexual abuse. Patriarchy constructs an idea of the victim and survivor of sexual violence, an idea of the victim that people can understand as such, but it also is sustained by certain ideas of masculinity, as both Jonathan and David talk about. A man in power, a man who cannot just wait to prove his sexual prowess, which obviously involves enthusiastically taking up any sexual opportunity with an attractive older woman. The ideas of masculinity that clash with Bennett's story, right? That don't make sense of Bennett's story for many people. Moreover, as I already said, their cases are indeed ambiguous, right? So Argento did enter in an on-off relationship with Weinstein, while Bennett, for instance, admittedly said that he had an intercourse with Argento and accepted to be in pictures with her afterwards. So in both cases, although in different ways, the sexual abuses and their aftermath do not match the frame of what sexual violence should look like, how victims are supposed to react to it, and how survivors are expected to conduct themselves in the aftermath of sexual abuse. So now one of the most powerful slogans of Me Too has been the incitement to believe all survivors. And many leaders of the movement, for example, were ready to hold that commitment, even in the case of Bennett, right? So someone who was effectively accusing one of the public faces of Me Too. Too many survivors are not believed in our societies, but what I want to suggest, and also I guess invite everyone to think about, is that believing the claims of some survivor is more difficult than it might seem, because those claims are made unintelligible through the discursive frames through which we make sense of sexual abuse. But it doesn't mean that everyone cannot make sense of them, right? But that the sort of discursive frame prevalent in society makes these claims more difficult to be understood as claims of sexual abuse. But if the aim is actually to make sense of cases like those of Asia Argento and Jimmy Bennett's, the complexity of sexual abuse needs to be, I think, embraced. So representation politics can do a lot. Of course, the more we are exposed to a diverse group of victims and survivors, the more hopefully we'll be able to challenge our current discourse on sexual abuse that constructs a specific time of victimhood and survivor. We might become able to, for instance, make sense of someone like Bennett as a victim of sexual abuse. But we might well be unable to exit the logic of discourse formation, which always leaves certain claims unheard because not intelligible under the current discourse. So I think that the movement that really aims to dismantle what Alford calls the discursive formations of rape culture will have to embrace rather than ensure the language of ambiguity and ground its politics in the ambivalence of what again Alford calls sexual violence. This is difficult, it's tricky, it's painful, and it's challenging. It entails fighting patriarchy and power relations, and all those dynamics that Mike was previously talked about. I think it also means accepting that patriarchy and power relations are complex, messy, and the sexual violation as a product of them is complex and messy too. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, that was fantastic. I'm just thinking, let's see, have we got any questions? Anna's asked a question. Let me just find it. Anna has asked, oh sorry, I was going to let Anna say it if she'd like to.
It's okay, you can just say it, don't worry.
No, it's okay. I think I've spoke too much already.
Yeah, my question was just, moving forward, what do you see as the ideal form of allyship? Like, as we develop as a society, what do you see as the ideal way moving forward to ally the feminist movement?
I don't know who wants to take that, maybe David or I feel like, or Jonathan, but then I feel like, should I ask the men? Maybe not.
I'll chip in with my thoughts quickly. Just that allyship is really dependent on what you're allying to and who you are, and I think it's not necessarily the right approach to look to what the universal form of allyship is. You know, my allyship, for example, with Indigenous feminists' search for emancipation and justice in Australia is not the same as it might be for me in the UK, where different power relations exist. But in general, I do think some of the principles that came out of the sort of gay liberation allyship discussions around reflexivity, around being, you know, a supporter rather than trying to take up more public and dominant space is valuable. But again, I just think that there's a risk if we talk about Me Too or feminism or these struggles as overly unified, because there are obviously really different politics between different groups, and what they demand of an ally is going to be really radically different.
Has anybody else got anything they'd like to add on that?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I suppose, I guess because I did speak quite a bit about allyship, maybe there might be an expectation that I say something. But like, honestly, like, I'll be honest with you. Like, I mean, I just think that's such a hard question, and I don't. I mean, I mean, as with David, I have very serious misgivings about my, well, my capacity or anyone's capacity to prescribe any kind of model of allyship that would be something that we could just simply kind of take off the shelf and then put to use. I think so my argument is kind of more a negative one. It's sort of like, I feel like I might know it when I see it, but I feel like most of the dominant assumptions and models of allyship that we currently have, I find deeply unsatisfactory, partly for the reasons I outlined, and also for the reasons that David has outlined. I mean, like, if you're going to talk about allyship, then it immediately begs the question of ally to whom, or ally to what. And I think that's far from a straightforward question. I mean, another thing which I touched on but might be worth mentioning again is that I have to confess I have reservations about the very word allyship, and I think it's because, and I appreciate others may disagree, this is not a hill I'm going to die on, but like, we live, I would certainly argue that we live in a kind of cultural and political moment that is profoundly neoliberal, right? And neoliberal assumptions, individualistic, sort of competitive, hierarchical, individualistic neoliberal assumptions have permeated into basically all spheres of contemporary social, cultural, and political life, including those where we may perceive ourselves as being against neoliberalism. And I just worry that it's very hard. I'm not even sure it's possible to even talk about allyship without getting tied up in a kind of neoliberal logic of sort of whereby ally becomes a form of self-identity that we take on, right? And to be honest, I mean, like, God, I'm going to sound like a sort of real old school kind of lefty here, but like, I suppose I prefer thinking about notions of collectivity and solidarity, or dare I say it, comradeship. You know, I feel like those seem to allude more strongly to a kind of collective anti-neoliberal politics, rather better than the notion of allyship does, which I think, to me, always seems to fall back on the question of how do I as an individual become a good ally? You know, and people will write, you know, innumerable comment pieces about how to be a good ally, and I worry about the political efficacy of that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just having a look for some more questions for you. I've got one from Lewis, if he's free to ask.
Yeah, I can do. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, so the question is, and it's sort of related to some of the things I've seen in politics and so on. So there's like all women shortlists that are coming forward, which have obviously helped bring, sorry, I'm in another call, they're all shouting at me. So there's positive discrimination sort of put forward to promote women into positions. Is that the best way forward, that we try and give women that boost up in areas where they're perhaps sidelined, or does that seek to sort of lead to an imbalanced future and slow down sort of progress towards gender equality? hope that's clear. Thank you.
I'm not sure who'd want to take on that question. Anybody? Pinar, would you like that one?
I can try. It definitely addresses a structural imbalance in the system, but can it provide the solution to the problem comprehensively? Obviously not. You know, it is. Like in many experiences, it's just privileged women. And also kind of raises the question of difference, and without some sort of a understanding of representative politics, just a quota on the number of women representatives would not be enough. And yeah, like I can also briefly say a little bit about allyship and how like the previous one that I was not sure before, but like we also have to remember that, you know, the allyship and solidarity questions are also questions within feminism itself. Like feminists have a contested relationship with both of those terms, and yeah, like once again it becomes the question, like the wider questions of class and privilege and yeah, opportunities are like we always have to consider them. That's about it.
Thank you.
May I just jump in to say something about it? So it's a very interesting question. I mean, I personally don't think that you know, necessarily like all women shortlist are the solution for what is a structural and you know, Pinar was mentioning like intersectional issue. But I'm always a bit interested in the reaction against all women shortlist, because sometimes when we sort of reactions are about, you know, unfair privilege, right, unfair discrimination, they may come from social groups in society who have been like privileged and unfairly, right, put on the top for a very long time. So, you know, you had all a male, and very often they were all white, straight, and able-bodied men shortlist for a very long time. So I don't think that the issue is about unfair discrimination. It's more complex, and it has to do with you know, whether it's, you know, is it really a solution to how patriarchy shapes the workplace and shapes different opportunities. But we should also, I think, pay attention to the reaction to all women shortlists, because they can tell us something about society, and maybe sometimes something about the very people who criticize all male shortlists that are quite telling and interesting. I'm done.
Jocelyn, I think, has a point to add on this topic, if you'd like.
I'd just like to say that I agree that there have been positive action and affirmative action for men for a very, 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 very long time, for all men, for white men, for black men, for all, from all ethnicities. Now, their privilege and their affirmative action for them and positive action has been directed for them within their own communities. So when I say that black men have been privileged, I mean they've been privileged in relation to black women. And of course they suffer race discrimination as a whole, but I do think we have to recognise that there is this overall affirmative action for men. And I can think about education, for example, when women went into education, because women were told, if you've got any intelligence, be a teacher. If you're sort of halfway, be a nurse, and otherwise be a secretary. And those were the choices, allegedly, that women were given. Whereas men had many more choices. Men would be thinking about becoming a physicist or a lawyer, etc. And that meant that you had a lot of women in teaching who were really, really intelligent. And there was affirmative action for men to go into teaching because there was a recognition that you had to have some sort of gender parity. But then what happened was that the men who went into teaching began running the teaching, and you had male principals of primary schools. And therefore, I think that all women's shortlists are absolutely essential, because it's one way of trying to redress the balance. And it's not just about having women on those lists for those women, it's for society as a whole, because you can't have a parliament, for example, serving the people that does not represent the people. And so the all women shortlists are really not for women in the Labour Party where they exist. They're actually for the population as a whole, so that the population as a whole has a choice as to who they will have representing them. And I'd just like to make a quick point on this business about allies. You see, the problem is that, in my opinion, it's extraordinarily patronising for men to be calling themselves allies of women. What is needed is for men to do some jolly good work on themselves. Women have been doing work on themselves for absolutely centuries, that we've been doing work on ourselves because we've been told there's something wrong with us, we have to get our act together, we must improve ourselves, etc. And so then we either think, right, well, we have to go into this man's world and become achieving in that way, or else women go into the domestic sphere and think they have to be achieving in that way. But we're doing work constantly on ourselves, and yet what we're confronted with is men who, I'm afraid, are doing very little work because they're so busy saying they're going to be allies to us. And it's really like the mansplaining issue that we have. I mean, mansplaining, I'm sure you all know, but it came from Rebecca Solnit, because she was at a conference and a man sat down with her and her friend, more or less saying, you know, you're all alone, and began talking about a book and how wonderful the book was. And Rebecca Solnit's friend said, well, actually, Rebecca's the author. And so this man immediately disappeared, and he'd been busy saying what this book was full of. It was her book. And I'm afraid that that happens time and time and time again. And that's why women get pretty tired of it all and think that it'd be a good idea if men started doing work on themselves, instead of saying that they can actually come with us and, you know, more or less try to help us to be somehow better integrated, I think. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone want to add to that, or should we move on to another question? I think I'll take the silence that you've covered that topic. Okay, sorry, I've just found the next question. This is from Neha. Is there any significance in the Me Too movement originating in the US? And if so, what does this tell us about US values regarding gender and whistleblowing? I don't know who would like to take that one. Maybe Jonathan, who'd like that one?
Blimey, I don't know. I mean, I think, yes, it probably does tell us something important about the centrality of American culture and politics within not just feminism, but within kind of, well, certainly within Anglophone and within kind of, you know, sort of global kind of cultural and political life more generally. I mean, the specific question around whistleblowing, I mean, yes, I mean, there is, to be frank, I would defer to my fellow panel members on that specific question. So yeah, I think it is significant, but I'd be hesitant about, I need to think a bit more before I thought about the precise nature of that significance.
I think, sorry, just maybe to add, it was like with that question, it's kind of this thing, like I think it was David that mentioned maybe the bad apple like phenomenon where, so Weinstein being thrown under the bus to save patriarchy as a structure. I don't know whether that kind of ties into like the US values and like the idea of what a man should be, and whether there's anything to be said on that, and like whether the patriarchy and like the negative elements of it will outlast this resurgence of popular feminism, like you were saying. Maybe.
I might just add, so a bunch of the research I did for this project was in Fiji and in Aceh in 2 different contexts, and mostly I don't work on the global north. There are equivalent movements and initiatives like Me Too all around the world that may be rebranded or reprocessed in relation to Me Too because of the dominance of the Anglosphere and how that's taken off. But there are similar moments that you see. You know, while I was over there, there was a big discussion about men associated with the military killing their partners in the street. And this led to a big campaign, Man Up Fiji, which was very similar to the sort of male advocate programs that we see around the world, but idealize a pretty patriarchal vision of masculinity and say men should just man up, because the problem is that men weren't being manly enough in the first place. And this, in that case, sort of had this, in terms of whistleblowers, difficult dynamic I found interviewing women's activists and definitely some of the trans activists there, where that might be the official message, and particularly for politicians or people in public places, it was advantageous for them to say they were advocates or they were allies or they were supporters. But then behind the scenes, I would still hear stories from people, not naming any names, that when they tried to get specific action on abusers who were in the public eye, them and their families would be threatened. They would face potential blowback and violence from the people who would then go and do big events as advocates for, you know, gender equality. So I think that there is a particular American dynamic in relation to the idealized big man and how that narrative plays out. But I do think there are some broader dynamics in the way that neoliberal or authoritarian institutions have adopted the language of feminism very coyly to rebrand themselves as reformed, non-patriarchal institutions while using exactly that to reinforce their position. Henry McTernan has a very interesting paper on what this looks like within the security sector and how all these actors have positioned themselves as sort of the good guys, but basically in doing that have used it to stop criticism of themselves as for being patriarchal.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything on that question?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that that's a very, very interesting question. I largely agree with what Jonathan David said. Also, you know, about what that tells us about the dominance of the Anglo-American sphere, right, in our sort of collective imaginary, especially because like movements, campaigns similar to Me Too or resonating with Me Too were present also elsewhere, but they didn't make a splash, right? I think that, you know, we need to resist the temptation of thinking that because Me Too started, Me Too as we know it, right, started in the US, that means that the US is a state necessarily more committed to gender equality or really living up to ideals of gender equality compared to other states, because of course, the sort of image of states as the promoters of gender equality is also contested in the feminist movement, but when it comes to then international relations, there is this image of liberal, democratic Western states as the states that really promoted gender equality and defend that value against other, like bad states that don't, that fail with regard to gender equality. So we need to, I think, resist that sort of temptation of thinking that because Me Too, as we know, it started in the US, that means something about the US as the sort of good leader internationally when it comes to promoting gender equality.
Yeah, thank you. Has anybody else got any other questions? I don't think we've got any more questions. I think Thomas has got one, if you'd like to ask, or if Pinar, you'd like to say something on that.
Just a very brief kind of a remark, basically, to add on. The discussion in the US is that, like, even in Hollywood, when right now the producers are becoming more kind of aware of the dynamics of sexual kind of assault and issues regarding that. What has happened in the set of Big Little Lies, which is a series about which problematizes like domestic abuse and is like cherished for its like female cast. And when they switched to a female director, there was a controversy that the previous director intervened into the creativity of the process and took control over completely by the end of series 2. So like even these developments show that even right now, even the good guys can slip back, but the US definitely sets up an example, and we have to consider it for the better and worse, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thomas, if you'd like to make your point.
I mean, I guess my question kind of goes back to apparently there was, in the early 90s, there was also a discussion on sexual harassment that was started by the Anita Hill revelations that led to 1994 being declared the year of the woman, where a record number of women got elected. But then kind of the whole thing kind of petered out and then got reignited by Weinstein. So I guess my question is this going to follow the same path? Is this going to peter out and then 20 years down the line we realize something else has happened? Or if not, why not? Like, why is this different, and why is this continuing to have oxygen as it rightly should do?
Who would like that one?
I can start.
I don't know. Yeah.
I think it always happened, like when you look at it from the outside to the more to what's going on in the women's rights movement. It happens in waves, and there are kind of periods where the issues of the women's rights and freedoms are more on the agenda, and there are times when when there's a setback. But when you ask the activists, I'm sure anyone would agree that the struggle is continuous and it never really peters out, it is continuous, and people the activists are always trying to pass the torch, and each generation has different kind of reframing of similar issues and everything. So it may phase out, but it will come back again.
Yeah, I mean, if you like, I can have a go at. Well, I feel like I should probably say something, because it was me who kind of raised the question of the historical kind of scope of the whole thing. So, I mean, the short answer is, I think it's very hard to say, and no one can anticipate what the longer term consequences of Me Too and broader forms of contemporary feminist mobilization will be. But I have to admit, one thing that has surprised me, okay, is how it is the longevity of this kind of this resurgence or upsurge of feminism that I mentioned, that I think started. I mean, obviously, it varies significantly depending on the specific context, but certainly in the kind of global north and an Anglophone context, I feel like it really started to gather momentum in the late 2000s, and it has maintained itself, I think, throughout the 2010s, and it's undergone various kind of transformations kind of during that time. So I mean, I think inevitably Me Too specifically, and contemporary feminist forms of feminist activism more generally may well fizzle out. But I suppose in terms of making sense of it, the kind of dilemma that we always face is, on the one hand, I think it is helpful to think of the history of feminism and radical movements more generally in relation to waves and those kinds of metaphors that we use around kind of upsurges and then kind of periods of abeyance. And I think one thing we have to do is, I think it is helpful to use those metaphors, but also being mindful of the fact, and I guess this was what Pinar was alluding to a minute ago, mindful of the fact that those kinds of historical narratives where you might say, as I kind of did, oh, there was a big wave in the 70s, then it all went into decline and now it's back up again, that always risks doing a kind of violence, if you like, to the more complicated, more local histories of feminist activism and of forms of radical politics more generally. And I think it's about, I suppose, if we, as I hope some of us might be, are interested in how we narrate the history of feminist politics, I think we have to, it's quite a careful balancing act to keep those, to be able to make general claims, but not in such a way that we kind of override the specifics and the complexities of local histories in different contexts. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, Jocelyn, if you'd like to say anything on that point that you've just made in the chat, because I think it would be really interesting for people to hear more on that, about dominant cultures silencing women, or if you'd like to. Oh, you're on mute, sorry. I'll ask. Oh, sorry. Oh, I keep muting you.
That's it. I'd just like to say I really appreciate what Pinar said. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Yeah. Because so often we hear about the waves of feminism. There have never been waves of feminism or waves of the women's movement. As Pinar says, women have always been active and women have always spoken out. But it's just that at some time, for some reason, our voices are allowed to get out there. I mean, take the 1950s, centuries ago, the 1950s, when, because I did one of my PhDs was on the struggle for equal pay. And if you look at the 1950s, when the notion was that that was one time when women were silent, actually the reality is that women weren't. And out of my research, I found that women were actually more active in the 1950s than they really were in the 1960s, although the 1960s is projected as the beginning of the second wave, I think it's called, when in fact that women have been at this, as I said earlier, for centuries. I mean, and the thing about it is that we women even fall into the trap, because how many women talk about the waves of feminism and they buy into the dominant story about what women are and what we've done or what we haven't done. And that narrative, which is totally false, has to actually be done away with. And so that's why I'm so pleased that you said what you said. And I would agree that it is highly likely that the dominant culture will get sick of Me Too after a while, and therefore it will sort of, it won't peter out. By no means will it peter out, but it won't be a part of the I suppose, it's not the dominant discussion, but a part of what's going on in terms of discussion that is obvious and out there and in the media. And I'd like, because people are talking about books, I'd like to make a plug for, I don't know if you can see it, but Rose McGowan's book, Brave. Now, interestingly, I bought this because I did a review of the 2 books that are on the main books on the Harvey Weinstein thing. She said, and then the other one is Mia Farrow's son, Ronan Farrow. And they're both really, really good books, really worth reading. But so is this one. And you see, you think about Rose McGowan as some sort of, I'm sorry about the term, but some sort of dingbat, because she was in something I think called Charmed. It was some sort of television thing. And it really was pretty facile, though it was about 3 women. And they were in charge in many ways. They were in charge. But this book is really revelatory. She was brought up in a cult in Italy. Her family was in the cult. And she talks about Hollywood as actually being a cult too. And she's very, very strong on a whole lot of issues on, and I'll just give you one. She talks about memory, and articulation and women's bodies. And the point that she makes is that if women have been sexually abused, women's bodies remember. And so when women are being told in court, for example, that their stories are changing, it's because the memory that you retain in your mind is not the same as the memory that your body retains. And if you've been raped, she makes the point, your body knows that you have. And I think that's a really important point to make. And perhaps the final point I'll make is that really interests me. And if you guys think about it, I think you'll say it's true. If you have a physical injury, it hurts when you have it, but eventually the pain disappears. But if you have an emotional injury, it never disappears. Emotional injuries stay with you forever. And it's not that you walk along the street, you know, with your head hanging down and in total disrepair, although that does happen to some women and men. But I think that's so fascinating. And you think about it in terms of some sort of emotional trauma that you've had, and you know that it actually stays with you. And that's what she's saying about sexual abuse and rape, that your body knows. And that's, I think, why you actually retain it as a part of a body memory, which doesn't always match what's in your head, because your head is being told another story, that you're making it up, that it's lies, etc., etc. Anyway, thanks. I should add, thanks so much. I have to say thank you to Thomas Ron, because it was Thomas that put me onto this. And I just think it's I've so appreciated being able to be involved in the discussion and to listen. So thank you. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you. No, thank you. That was amazing. I don't know if anyone else would like to speak on that, if they want to contribute to that, or if anyone's got any more questions.
Yeah, maybe I can say something again about the wave story, because I think, you know, that it's, I mean, on the one hand, it's a powerful story, it's a useful analytical device, and I think that I'm always quite surprised to see how many students in gender and politics module, like just, you know, use for sort of categories. But the problem is that by using this category, we simplify the idea waves. We simplify these historical phases. And, you know, in addition to the problem that has already been discussed, that we tend to think that then, you know, like feminists were women were very active in the 60s, then in the 90s, and, you know, in between there was nothing, before there was something towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, you know, and of course that's a big problem. But another well, two other problems for me with the wave story. So one is that it tends to overlook and gloss over disagreements among feminists, you know, as if you can actually pin down the second wave as a phase where all feminists agreed about issues like sex, right? So the wave story goes to say, you know, the second wave feminists were very critical of sex, and then third wave feminists were like very sex positive and gone, you know, that's not true, like, and that's a problem, right? So when we neglect the disagreement among feminists, because as other speakers mentioned during the event, feminists disagree a lot. There's no one feminism, and actually those disagreements, as painful they may be, they're also very instructive. And so when what becomes like canonized as the wave always you know, like pushes outside different voices, and historically it's been the case with women of color, right? You know, the history of women of color's resistance to patriarchy, racism, sexism, and heteronormativity doesn't really match the wave story, and so it's just pushed aside, right, as a sort of maybe, you know, fancy topics that someone teaches 1 week, right, instead of deeply informing all the issues we talk about. And that's connected with the other problem with the wave stories, that it really sort of also pictures feminism as a Western phenomenon, right? And that's a problem too. So again, useful analytical device, but when we use these devices like a bit uncritically as a sort of shortcuts for a position, an argument that we want to ally, then you know, we are going to have big problems. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if we've got any more questions.
Just to add very briefly,
sorry, Pinar,
one thing. Yeah, maybe we should, you know, think about, it's not an original idea in what I will be saying, but like think about the waves and feminism like an ocean wave that doesn't really separate from one another. You know, it is like a movement of waves. Like, so maybe in feminism we should, when we talk about the waves in feminism, we should kind of restructure the way we talk about it. And rather than giving like a progression of different stages, we can still use the term, but kind of say that they're never separate from one another. And it never ends, like in the between periods, the struggle never ends.
Something I might say how much I found useful Claire Hemming's book, Why Stories Matter, on the narratives around waves and feminism, and sort of the harm that can be done to the feminist movement by thinking about these things as discrete moments, and that, like you're saying, you know, exactly.
Thank you. I think we've all got quite a good collection of books to buy after this is finished. I'm not sure if we've got any more questions. If anyone would like to ask one, they can ask now, or I think they're holding the piece. If no one else has got anything to add, then should we wrap it up? I mean, I just got to thank all the panelists for the great discussion that we've had tonight. I think it's been absolutely fantastic, and I know I can't speak for everyone, but I've made pages and pages of notes on what you've all been saying. I think it's so enlightening. Thank you for everybody who's got involved and asked questions and contributed. Thank you to Thomas and Gemma and PolSoc for organising this talk. I think Thomas has got something he wants to add.
Well, first of all, thank you, Rhiannon, for chairing this. Thank you very much for agreeing to chair this. You did a fantastic job. yeah, on behalf of PolSoc, thank you to the panelists and thank you for everyone for attending. A few sort of announcements for future events. In about a week's time, we're going to be doing a talk about the Afghan peace process with the ambassador of Afghanistan to the United States attending. You'll be able to see details of that on our page on Facebook, which is the York Politics Society, and our Instagram account, which is York PolSoc. Additionally, for those of you who are at York who are students, if you want to get involved in PolSoc, we'll be having an extraordinary general meeting on the 7th of September at 6:30, where we'll have a number of positions up, including Women's Officer, which is a newly created position. We're creating liberation positions. All our year officers will be up, as well as External Events Officer, which is the position that's in charge of organizing these events. I'm only doing it in an acting capacity. So if you're interested in getting involved in PolSoc, please come along to the EGM. We'd really like to see you all there. Come along to next week's event on Afghanistan. We have a number of great events coming up, and we look forward to seeing you all there. And thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Rhiannon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Bye, thanks.
Bye, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
And what we discussed is